The suffocating stench of copper blood and decaying flesh hangs heavy under the blazing North African sun, baking into the arid wind. Across the unforgiving sand, 700 mutilated bodies lie in agonizing ruin, their hands and legs surgically severed, left to slowly succumb to the merciless heat without the dignity of a quick execution. Carthage had just survived a 23-year meat grinder against the relentless machinery of the Roman Republic. They had exhausted their treasury, lost their fleets, and signed a humiliating peace treaty, but they had survived. Yet, the true threat was not arriving on Roman galleys. It was waiting right outside their gates. 20,000 hardened veterans, mercenaries who had held the lines in Sicily for a generation, were camped in the dust, expecting to be paid the silver talents they were promised. Instead of honoring their debt, the wealthy merchants and aristocrats of the Carthaginian Senate offered only empty excuses, delays, and demands for discounts. They believed they could out-negotiate men who only knew how to speak through violence. History has proven a terrifying reality regarding the mechanics of power. When an imperial government refuses to pay its seasoned killers, those killers will inevitably turn their weapons inward and take the empire for themselves. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we peel back the layers of the Mercenary War of 240 BCE, an internal uprising so devoid of military convention and human mercy that the ancient world simply remembered it as the Truceless War. The existential threat to the survival of Carthage did not begin with the breach of its massive stone walls. It began with a catastrophic administrative mistake. The war with Rome had just ended with the Treaty of Lutatius in 241 BCE. Carthage's military apparatus was entirely unique in the ancient Mediterranean context. Unlike the citizen soldier legions of the Roman Republic, the Carthaginian state relied almost exclusively on a complex network of foreign contractors. This was not a unified national force driven by patriotism, but a lethal mosaic of native Libyans, Iberian swordsmen, towering Celtic warriors from Gaul, and highly specialized Balearic slingers. For years, they had fought under Carthaginian banners in the grueling theater of Sicily, holding the line and bleeding for a merchant city most had never even laid eyes upon. When the peace treaty was signed, it carried an extortionate war indemnity. The sharp, metallic clinking of 3,200 silver talents being systematically weighed, crated, and shipped across the sea to Rome became the defining auditory rhythm of Carthage's defeat. Behind the heavy bronze doors of the central treasury, the vaults echoed with an unprecedented, hollow emptiness. The vast wealth of the maritime empire had evaporated to satisfy Roman demands, leaving absolutely nothing to compensate the 20,000 seasoned combatants now being ferried back to the North African coast. The initial demobilization plan was strategically sound. The military command in Sicily, fully recognizing the tactical danger of a concentrated unpaid army, deliberately shipped the mercenaries back to the capital in small, manageable detachments. The administrative design was straightforward. The Senate would pay off each returning cohort upon arrival and immediately disperse the men to their distant homelands before the next unit disembarked. However, the Council of Elders, paralyzed by their depleted coffers and blinded by aristocratic arrogance, fundamentally mismanaged the logistics. Instead of honoring the military contracts, they halted the payments entirely. The politicians decided to wait until the entire army had crossed the Mediterranean, foolishly calculating that they could leverage the sheer size of the force to negotiate a bulk discount on the owed wages. As a direct result of this stalling tactic, the small isolated detachments organically merged into a massive, restless host camped right outside the capital's walls. As provisions dwindled, the friction between the idle, heavily armed soldiers and the Carthaginian civilian population spiked into dangerous skirmishes. Alarmed by the escalating tension, the government issued a fateful directive. They ordered the mercenary commanders to break camp and march their men to the inland provincial city of Sicca, promising that all logistical and financial grievances would be resolved once they relocated. By moving 20,000 frustrated veterans into one massive camp at Sicca, the Carthaginian Senate believed they were isolating a nuisance, but they had just assembled the deadliest rebel army in the ancient world. Oblivious to the powder keg they had just concentrated, the Carthaginian Senate dispatched an official envoy to renegotiate the military contracts. Their choice of diplomat was a fatal miscalculation. Instead of sending a seasoned commander who had bled alongside the veterans in Sicily, the politicians sent Hanno the Great. Hanno was a wealthy aristocrat whose primary wartime achievement had been expanding Carthaginian estates into the African interior, ruthlessly taxing and oppressing the native Libyans. Crucially, these same Libyans comprised the largest single faction within the mercenary camp. When Hanno stepped before the assembled troops, demanding they accept a fraction of their promised wages to alleviate the state's financial burden, he was speaking to men who already despised him. The negotiation was doomed before a single word was translated. The sheer physical weight of the encounter immediately overwhelmed the diplomatic facade. As Hanno spoke from his pavilion, the heavy, stale scent of sun-baked leather, oiled iron, and thousands of armored bodies pressed inward. The ground vibrated slightly as ranks of restless infantry shifted their footing, kicking up a low, persistent cloud of dry earth that coated the negotiations in a gritty tension. The logistical reality of a multi-ethnic mercenary army made peaceful dialogue impossible. Hanno spoke in Punic, a language entirely foreign to the Iberian swordsmen, Celtic shock troops, and Balearic slingers. Messages had to be relayed through a disjointed chain of interpreters, and with each translation, the political nuances were stripped away, leaving only the bare, insulting demand for a pay cut. Anger rippled through the localized contingents, creating a volatile surge of tactical pressure as different factions misread commands and began drawing weapons. Realizing the aristocrat offered nothing but empty rhetoric, the army simply turned its back on him. Order completely collapsed, replaced by the unified marching rhythm of 20,000 furious combatants. The veterans struck their camp at Sicca and mobilized with the terrifying efficiency of a professional fighting force. They retraced their route toward the capital, the heavy impact of their boots and baggage trains carving a path of intimidation straight through the Carthaginian heartland. They did not stop until they reached Tunis, establishing a heavily fortified position just 10 miles from the walls of Carthage itself. With the diplomatic window slammed shut and replaced by an immediate siege threat, panic finally gripped the Carthaginian Senate. Desperate to undo their mistake, they hastily dispatched a highly respected military commander, Gisco, equipped with the full amount of silver required to pay the men off. Gisco arrived at the sprawling encampment outside Tunis with the arrears in full, setting up his tribunals to disperse the silver by nationality. For a brief moment, the crisis teetered on the edge of resolution. However, the prospect of peace was a death sentence for the men who had already orchestrated the early stages of the mutiny. Two figures emerged from the ranks to seize absolute control of the narrative. Spendius, a fugitive Campanian slave who knew that demobilization meant being handed back to Roman executioners, and Mathos, a charismatic Libyan commander who understood that Carthage never forgave native insubordination. So they realized that if the veterans accepted their pay and dispersed to their homelands, the ringleaders would be left behind to face crucifixion. Working the crowds with calculated urgency, Spendius and Mathos systematically shouted down any officer who advocated for the settlement. They weaponized the army's lingering resentment, convincing the infantrymen that the Carthaginian gold was merely a delaying tactic. a temporary bribe designed to disarm them before the Senate hunted them down individually. The tactical pressure within the camp shifted abruptly from a financial grievance to a matter of pure survival. When Gisco, attempting to maintain military discipline, sharply rebuked a Libyan soldier for demanding impossible terms, the fragile diplomatic tether snapped completely. At a prearranged signal, Spendius and Mathos triggered the insurrection. Thousands of heavily armed men surged forward, the air filled with the sharp, chaotic impact of wooden shields colliding, and the frantic, echoing commands of Punic guards being overrun by the mob. Gisco and his retinue of 700 Carthaginian nobles were immediately overwhelmed, stripped of their armor, bound in iron chains, and dragged into the center of the camp as hostages. The mercenary army had officially crossed the threshold of rebellion, but Mathos understood that 20,000 men, no matter how seasoned, could not sustain a prolonged siege against the wealthiest port in the Mediterranean without extensive logistical support. He immediately dispatched couriers deep into the African interior, urging the native settlements to throw off the severe taxation of the imperial government. Although the response was catastrophic for the Senate, decades of heavy-handed agricultural quotas and forced levies had primed the provinces for revolution. Within weeks, the horizon beyond Tunis was obscured by massive, billowing clouds of dry ochre dust. A staggering 70,000 native Libyans answered the call, marching steadily toward the coast. The rhythmic, unrelenting tread of tens of thousands of feet on the hard-packed earth signaled a fundamental shift in the conflict. This was no longer a localized labor dispute over unpaid wages. It had mutated into a full-scale, continent-wide war of liberation aimed directly at the throat of the Carthaginian state. The sheer mass of the incoming Libyan auxiliaries transformed the mercenary camp into a sprawling, autonomous city of siege warfare, completely cutting off the capital's landward supply lines. Carthage was now trapped behind its own walls, besieged by the very men it had trained and equipped. While the siege lines tightened around the capital, the mercenary leadership faced an internal crisis. The sheer scale of the rebellion began to fracture the resolve of the rank and file. Whispers of Carthaginian amnesty and the promise of pardons circulated through the camps, tempting the less radical factions to lay down their arms and return to their homelands. Spendius recognized the existential threat this posed to his command. If the army surrendered, the ordinary soldiers might live, but the ringleaders would undoubtedly be handed over to the executioners. To ensure absolute loyalty, Spendius calculated that he had to engineer an atrocity so severe it would permanently sever any possibility of reconciliation. He needed to force the entire army into an unbreakable bond of collective guilt. The prisoner Gisco and his 700 Carthaginian nobles, who had been held in chains since the mutiny at Tunis, became the instruments of this strategy. Spendius orchestrated a public tribunal, declaring the captives guilty of conspiring against the newly formed coalition. The subsequent executions were carried out with clinical, systematic precision, deliberately stripping away any lingering conventions of ancient Mediterranean warfare. The prisoners were marched to the edge of the encampment. Their extremities were amputated. Their femurs were intentionally shattered. Finally, the maimed hostages were cast alive into open trenches and left to succumb to the harsh elements of the North African terrain. By making the rank and file complicit in the execution of the state's highest diplomats, Spendius achieved his tactical objective. Every mercenary standing outside the walls of Carthage now understood that surrender meant a guaranteed death sentence. When the dispatch detailing the massacre reached the capital, the reaction was not immediate panic, but a profound, chilling silence. Inside the Carthaginian Senate, the relentless political bickering and factional shouting that usually defined the chamber completely ceased. It was a heavy, airless quiet, representing the sound of an empire collectively realizing that the fundamental rules of military engagement had just been erased. The aristocrats understood that this was no longer a conflict over delayed silver or territorial control. It had devolved into a war of total extermination. In direct response, the Senate passed a decree of absolute, uncompromising vengeance. The policy of no quarter was officially enacted by the state. Any rebel combatant taken prisoner by Carthaginian forces from that day forward would face immediate execution, with many explicitly condemned to be crushed beneath the weight of the city's beasts of war. The conflict had officially spiraled into an abyss of reciprocal atrocities, permanently earning its historical moniker as the Truceless War. With all diplomatic avenues sealed in blood, Carthage handed absolute military authority to one man, Hamilcar Barca. And he was bringing the elephants. Hamilcar Barca did not inherit an imperial legion. He took command of a desperate remnant. Scraping together the last loyal citizen militia, surviving cavalry, and 70 trained war elephants, he marshaled a highly disciplined but severely outnumbered force of 10,000 men. Their immediate objective was to break the mercenary blockade, but the rebel army held a geographical stranglehold. The only viable land route out of the Carthaginian peninsula was blocked by the Bagradas River, and the mercenaries had heavily fortified the solitary bridge spanning its waters. A direct assault against seasoned veterans holding a narrow choke point would be tactical suicide. Instead of throwing his limited infantry at an immovable defense, Hamilcar studied the physical environment. He noticed a crucial meteorological anomaly at the river's mouth. When the coastal winds blew fiercely from a specific direction, the resulting sea swell pushed a massive temporary sandbar across the estuary, effectively halting the river's flow and creating a shallow hidden ford. Waiting patiently for the exact shift in the wind, Hamilcar mobilized his expeditionary force under the cover of darkness. The infantry and beasts marched in strict discipline across the submerged sandbar. By dawn, the 10,000 Carthaginian soldiers had bypassed the heavily guarded bridge and materialized squarely on the enemy's exposed flank. Caught completely off guard, the mercenary commander Spendius scrambled to crush the incursion. He directed 15,000 men from the bridge garrison and another 10,000 from the nearby siege camp at Utica to converge on Hamilcar's position. The rebel veterans surged forward, confident that their sheer numerical advantage would easily destroy the smaller Carthaginian force. But Hamilcar had anticipated this exact reaction. As the two massive bodies of infantry closed the distance, the Carthaginian vanguard executed a maneuver that required absolute, terrifying discipline. They turned their backs to the charging enemy and began to retreat. To the overeager mercenaries, it looked like a panicked rout. The rebel ranks immediately broke their strict formations, surging forward in a chaotic sprint to run down the fleeing militiamen. They abandoned their tactical cohesion for the promise of a swift kill. Then, upon a single sharp command, the Carthaginian retreat snapped into a rigid defensive line. The heavy infantry wheeled around, locking their shields into an unbreakable wall of wood and iron. The sudden impact of the disorganized rebel vanguard crashing into the Carthaginian shield wall echoed across the plains. A deafening crunch of splintering timber, buckling bronze, and the immediate, crushing physical pressure of bodies grinding against a disciplined formation. As the mercenary center stalled against this immovable line, Hamilcar unleashed his reserve. From the flanks, the Carthaginian cavalry and the 70 war elephants drove straight into the exposed, unstructured mob. The physical sensation of the counterattack was paralyzing. Long before the beasts made contact, the earth itself began to tremble beneath the boots of the rebel infantry. It was a rhythmic, bone-shaking vibration, the concentrated weight of 70 armored leviathans accelerating across the hard-packed dirt, kicking up blinding clouds of pulverized earth. The sheer psychological pressure of that approaching mass broke the mercenaries' nerve before the tusks even reached them. The rebel lines rapidly disintegrated. thousands were trampled into the soil or cut down by the pursuing cavalry as they fled in blind panic back toward the river. The Battle of the Bagradas River was a masterclass in combined arms and terrain exploitation, shattering the immediate blockade. Following the rout at the Bagradas River, the tactical initiative shifted entirely to Hamilcar Barca. By the campaign season of 238 BCE, Mathos and Spendius realized they could not defeat the Carthaginian combined arms on the open plains. Their only viable strategy was to drag the conflict into the unforgiving mountainous interior, where elephants and heavy cavalry would lose their forward momentum. Yet, Hamilcar was an apex predator of terrain. He did not engage the massive rebel host in a series of costly frontal assaults. Instead, he shadowed their movements, systematically harrying their flanks and severing their supply lines, deliberately herding the 40,000-strong mercenary army into a desolate, steep-sided canyon known to history as the Saw. Once the massive rebel column marched deep into the ravine, Hamilcar executed a flawless logistical encirclement. He fortified the narrow exits with entrenched Carthaginian infantry, sealing the trap, and simply waited. The terrain itself became the primary weapon of execution. The Saw was a natural prison of sheer, unscalable rock. Hamilcar had effectively removed the need to expend Carthaginian lives in direct combat. He outsourced the destruction of the enemy to geography and starvation. The physical environment within the canyon rapidly became intolerable. The North African sun beat down relentlessly, its agonizing heat reflecting off the stark stone walls to create a blistering stagnant oven. Without a steady water source, severe dehydration set in within days. The baked earth offered no sustenance, and the sheer, overwhelming concentration of 40,000 trapped men accelerated the consumption of whatever meager rations they carried. The tactical pressure shifted from the immediate threat of Carthaginian steel to the inescapable certainty of biological collapse. Military discipline completely dissolved under the extreme physiological stress of prolonged starvation. The descent into absolute desperation followed a grim mathematical logic. First, the mercenaries consumed their pack animals and remaining cavalry mounts. Now, when the horses were gone, they executed and consumed their Carthaginian prisoners. Finally, as the oppressive heat and systemic organ failure began to claim thousands, the survivors resorted to consuming the bodies of their own fallen comrades. This was the ultimate collapse of military order, the horrific terminus of a trapped army functioning entirely outside the bounds of human civilization. Recognizing that his forces were on the verge of total extinction, Spendius attempted to negotiate a surrender, offering himself and the high command in exchange for the lives of the remaining infantry. Hamilcar accepted the parley, but the moment the rebel leaders stepped into the Carthaginian camp, they were immediately seized and placed in heavy iron chains. The Carthaginian decree of no quarter remained absolute. While observing the capture of their generals, the remaining mercenaries, driven mad by hunger, launched a blind, disorganized charge toward the canyon exits. Weakened by famine and moving without cohesive leadership, they were effortlessly cut down by the disciplined Carthaginian defensive lines or trampled beneath the heavy tread of the war elephants. The extermination was comprehensive. 40,000 men marched into the Saw, and none marched out. With the rebel army annihilated in the canyon, Mathos, the original architect of the uprising, was still holding the city of Tunis, preparing for a final, desperate stand. Hamilcar Barca immediately marched his veteran infantry and surviving elephant corps from the desolate confines of the Saw directly to the walls of Tunis. The final rebel stronghold was heavily fortified, and Mathos still commanded a formidable garrison of determined Libyans. To break the defenders' morale, Hamilcar ordered the captive rebel general Spendius to be crucified in plain view of the city gates. The Carthaginian commander then divided his forces placing his subordinate officer, Hannibal, in charge of the siege lines on the opposite side of Tunis to ensure a complete blockade. However, the execution of Spendius did not induce panic. It triggered a calculated, desperate rage. Observing a lapse in discipline within Hannibal's encampment, Mathos ordered a sudden, overwhelming sally. The tactical pressure of thousands of Libyan infantry surging from the gates shattered the Carthaginian siege lines before a defensive formation could be properly organized. In the ensuing chaos, Mathos overran the camp and took Hannibal alive, but what followed was a grim display of reciprocal atrocities that defined this conflict. Mathos marched his men to the cross of his fallen comrade, lowered Spendius's corpse, and crucified the Carthaginian general on the exact same timber. To complete the retaliation, 30 high-ranking Carthaginian nobles were systematically executed at the base of the cross. The war had entirely stripped away the established conventions of military honor, leaving only a cycle of mirrored vengeance. The tactical setback was severe, but Hamilcar quickly stabilized his remaining forces. Recognizing that a prolonged siege would only bleed his already exhausted army, he maneuvered Mathos into a final decisive engagement on the open plains. Without the geographical advantage of the city walls, the remaining rebel infantry could not withstand the disciplined shock of the Carthaginian heavy cavalry and the crushing momentum of the advancing elephants. The mercenary coalition was annihilated, and Mathos was taken prisoner. The architect of the Truceless War was not granted a swift battlefield death. Mathos was transported back to the capital for a highly public execution. As the triumphant procession entered the city, the streets echoed with the rhythmic, biting friction of heavy hemp ropes dragging the rebel commander's body across the unforgiving Carthaginian paving stones. It was a slow, deliberate march of retribution, culminating in a torturous death at the hands of the civilian populace he had besieged for years. Carthage had finally crushed the rebellion, but the strategic landscape of the Mediterranean had fundamentally shifted. While the Carthaginian state was locked in its existential struggle, the Roman Senate had been observing with cold, opportunistic calculation. Blatantly ignoring the peace parameters of the Treaty of Lutatius, Rome dispatched military forces to illegally annex the Carthaginian island territories of Sardinia and Corsica. Carthage, militarily exhausted and financially bankrupt, could do nothing to stop the outright theft of its maritime provinces. The Roman theft of Sardinia left a scar on Hamilcar Barca's soul, a scar that would soon plunge the entire Mediterranean into fire. The gross incompetence of the Carthaginian Senate during the mercenary crisis fundamentally altered the internal balance of power within the empire. None of the wealthy aristocrats and merchant councils had nearly orchestrated their own annihilation over a delayed payroll, and the surviving military forces realized they owed their lives entirely to one commander. The veteran infantry and cavalry no longer fought for the state, the treasury, or the politicians. Their loyalty transferred completely and unconditionally to the Barcid family. Hamilcar Barca emerged from the Truceless War not merely as a victorious general, but as an untouchable warlord. Carthage had effectively been transformed into a military dictatorship in all but name, governed by the singular will of the man who had pulled it back from the brink of extinction. Disgusted by the rampant corruption of the capital, and acutely aware that the opportunistic Roman Republic would inevitably strike again, Hamilcar made a monumental strategic decision. He gathered his battle-hardened troops, the men who had survived both Roman legions and the grueling, merciless campaigns of the recent rebellion, and mobilized them away from North Africa. He transported his army across the sea to the untamed, resource-rich frontiers of Iberia. There, far from the meddling oversight of the Carthaginian elders, he began carving out a massive independent power base, securing the vast Iberian silver mines and recruiting local warriors to build the economic and military engine required for a future war of total retribution. Before departing the African coast forever, Hamilcar needed to ensure that his absolute hatred for the Romans would outlive his own command. Inside the cavernous, dimly lit sanctuary of the city's highest deities, the heavy scent of burning incense and iron-rich blood settled into the cold stone walls. The overwhelming, oppressive silence of the temple was broken only by the solemn, unwavering sound of a child's voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. Hamilcar led his 9-year-old son, Hannibal, to the sacred fire, instructing the boy to place his hands directly over the sacrificed offering on the altar. In that hushed, sacred dark, the child swore a binding blood oath to never show goodwill to the Roman Republic. The Truceless War did far more than simply preserve a weakened city-state. It served as the brutal forge that tempered the core veteran army, the exact same unbroken lineage of soldiers that would eventually follow that young boy across the Alps to bring Rome to the absolute edge of collapse. Yeah, history is rarely shaped by flawless institutions, but rather by the hardened remnants of broken ones, driven forward by the unyielding will of those who refuse to be extinguished. Please subscribe to our channel to relive these heroic chapters of history with us.